Welcome to the deep dive. We're going deep on economics today.
Yeah,
We'll be looking at global trade, uh, big corporations, and of course, inflation.
of course.
And to top it all off, we'll be discussing potential changes in taxes.
Sounds like a lot.
It is, but it's fascinating stuff.
Hmm.
Our main source for this deep dive is a really insightful conversation with Martin Visser, a journalist from De Telegraph.
Oh, he's great.
He really gets into the nitty-gritty of things. Our goal is to pull out the most important insights from that conversation.
Right. To help everyone understand what's driving these changes in our economy
Exactly. It's all about giving you a clearer picture of what's happening.
and why it matters.
All right, let's start with trade wars.
Okay.
These were, well, really initiated by the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Those import taxes he slapped on goods, Visser sees them as a possible sign of a major shift.
A shift away from what, exactly?
From that whole Adam Smith idea that countries should specialize in what they're best at.
The whole comparative advantage thing.
Right. Visser thinks we're moving into what's called a mercantilist era.
Which basically means what?
Countries acting more like, well, individual companies.
Looking out for themselves.
Yeah. Aiming for self-sufficiency.
Interesting. So countries become less reliant on each other.
That's the idea. But it challenges decades of economic thought.
Right.
The focus has been on efficiency and these global supply chains for so long.
True. So this is a real departure from that. Makes sense why a lot of economists are scratching their heads over this.
Yeah, many of them are criticizing this whole thing.
So it's more than just an economic strategy.
Visser definitely sees it as a political strategy too, with economic goals, of course.
What's the political angle?
Well, he believes it's all about trying to help those parts of the electorate who feel like they've been left behind.
The ones who've seen industries vanish over the years.
Exactly. But he asks this key question.
What's that?
Can these policies actually bring back those industries, like fully restore them?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just bringing back jobs isn't enough.
Right. It's about whether those jobs can be sustainable in the long run.
Okay, so that's trade wars in a nutshell. Pretty complicated stuff.
Yeah, it is. But let's move on to the next topic.
What's that?
The role and responsibility of big businesses. Visser talks about how tough it's becoming for financial journalists to get a hold of CEOs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, those at the top of major Dutch companies.
Why is that?
He thinks it's because the focus has shifted away from individual companies.
Okay.
It's become more about the broader economic landscape.
I see. So it's less about company X did this and more about the economy as a whole is doing that.
Exactly. And Visser observes that it's rare for CEOs to even engage in public discussion these days.
Beyond just talking about how green they are or keeping shareholders happy.
Right. There are exceptions, though.
Like who?
Visser mentions Dolph Vanderbrink.
From Heineken.
Yeah. He actually speaks out. He's pro-globalization and against populism.
So he's not afraid to take a stand.
Not really. But Visser says that many CEOs are afraid to stick their necks out.
Yeah, that makes sense. They don't want to alienate anyone.
Especially in this day and age, it seems like they're playing it very safe.
And you know, there was that whole thing with Paul Pullman at Unilever.
Yeah. The dividend tax issue.
That really showed the tension between big businesses and what the public and politicians think.
Totally. It felt like his complaints backfired.
And Visser noticed that Unilever's whole sustainability agenda changed after that.
Like they were trying to lay low.
Yeah, maybe. So why are so many CEOs disconnected from what's going on in society?
Visser thinks it's because they're so focused on global markets. Makes sense, right?
Especially with these huge multinational companies
But he argues that these companies still benefit from being in the Netherlands.
that use our infrastructure, our tax regulations.
Exactly. So he thinks they should be participating in the national conversation.
Contributing to the debate.
But they're just not. CEOs are barely on any talk shows.
It's not like they're all experts on everything, though.
Right. Visser acknowledges that CEOs are brilliant at running companies.
Doesn't necessarily make them public intellectuals.
Exactly. Still, he does point out that CEOs used to be much more prominent in public life.
Things have changed.
They really have. And Visser suggests that businesses might be losing control by ignoring the media and public discourse.
If they're not shaping the narrative, someone else will.
Precisely. And when you combine this lack of engagement with the fact that companies benefit from things like cheap labor and regulations that favor expats, well, it can cause division.
People start to feel like it's not a level playing field.
Okay, ready to tackle inflation.
Let's do it.
Visser starts by questioning the standard ways we measure inflation.
Okay, how so?
He asks if they really capture the true cost of things.
Like housing and energy bills?
Exactly. Those are huge expenses for people.
For sure. So what's he suggesting?
He points out that the Dutch inflation calculation method was actually revised recently.
To better reflect energy costs,
Yeah. It seems like they realized the old way wasn't accurate.
especially with how much energy prices have been fluctuating.
Makes you wonder what else might not be fully accounted for in these numbers.
That's a good point.
But even if the measurements are accurate, there's a problem.
What's that?
A single average inflation figure doesn't tell the whole story.
Right, because everyone experiences inflation differently.
Totally. It depends on your income, whether you own or rent.
Exactly. So moderate inflation for one person might be a huge burden for someone else,
Visser uses the example of rising rents.
which is a major issue in the Netherlands right now.
And it's a vicious cycle. Rents go up, that contributes to inflation.
But higher inflation also makes rents go up.
It's a rent price spiral, and those who rent are really stuck in the middle.
Yeah, it's tough. And it's not just renters. Homeowners are affected too.
True. But the impact depends on when they bought their home.
Someone who just bought is facing much higher mortgage rates.
Yeah, and the rising costs of everything else just add to the burden.
Compared to someone who bought years ago, their situation is totally different.
Visser also brings up this interesting concept, Dirkzoonwoning, he calls it.
Toeketskanwoning.
It means a well-insulated house.
Okay.
And he's basically saying that those who live in poorly insulated homes are hit hardest by energy costs.
Makes sense. They're using more energy to heat their homes.
And when energy prices go up, they really feel it.
So it's not just about income, but also about things like housing quality.
Exactly. It's a much more nuanced picture than just looking at an average inflation rate.
You've got to look at the details.
Thankfully, the Dutch central bank is trying to get that message across.
They're acknowledging that inflation affects different groups differently.
Which is crucial because these figures are used for so many important decisions.
They impact monetary policy, wage negotiations, everything.
People's lives are directly affected by these numbers.
So we've got to make sure we understand them properly.
Speaking of which, Visser mentions the current Dutch inflation rate,
It's still pretty high.
around 3.7, 3.8%. And it's been stubborn, not going down as quickly as hoped.
Why is that?
Well, he doesn't have a definitive answer, but he does find it interesting that the political response has been so slow.
Maybe they were hoping it would be a temporary thing.
Possibly. Or maybe there are political reasons behind it we don't really know.
And it's not like the European Central Bank can just solve the problem for the Netherlands specifically,
Right. They have to consider the entire Eurozone.
which has countries with very different economic situations.
So a solution that works for one might not work for another.
What about the reasons for higher inflation in the Netherlands specifically?
Visser says it's likely a combination of factors.
Like what?
Well, the Dutch economy is strong.
Which means,
Higher wages, which can push prices up.
okay.
And then there are government policies, things like VAT and excise taxes.
Oh yeah, like that upcoming increase in petrol duty.
Exactly. Those things directly impact prices. But Visser also points to another potential factor,
that?
government spending.
Hasn't the government been spending a lot in recent years?
They have. It's a big contrast to the austerity measures after the financial crisis.
Seems like there's been a real shift in thinking.
Definitely. There's more willingness to use government spending to stimulate the economy.
Especially with interest rates being so low for so long.
Borrowing didn't seem as risky.
But all that government money can lead to inflation too.
Visser specifically mentions the Growth Fund and the Nitrogen Fund.
Huge amounts of money being pumped into the economy.
And it all has to go somewhere.
True. But there's also the question of whether the spending is actually effective.
Visser worries about that, especially in areas like education.
Yeah, just throwing money at a problem doesn't always solve it.
Sometimes it's about more than just the funds.
Like a shortage of qualified teachers, for instance.
That's a good example. But it's tricky to say whether the Netherlands is spending too much overall.
We do have a budget deficit, even with relatively low national debt.
It's a complicated picture,
But it's important to remember where that government revenue comes from.
which is mainly
Taxes on labor and consumption. VAT, in particular,
corporate taxes play a much smaller role.
especially for those big multinational companies.
And then there's the Dutch income tax system.
Very progressive.
It is. But Visser points out that it can place a heavy burden on the middle class.
They're not rich enough to benefit from all the loopholes,
But they're not poor enough to qualify for a lot of the social safety net programs.
so they end up paying a lot.
Which is interesting because recent government policies have actually resulted in significant income leveling.
even though they often talk about supporting the middle class.
Actions speak louder than words, I guess.
One last point about inflation. Visser found it quite surprising how much the lowest income groups were compensated for energy costs during the recent crisis.
Yeah, they were given a lot of support,
It's like the government decided to protect the most vulnerable.
regardless of the cost.
Interesting. Okay, ready for the last part of our deep dive. Bring it on. What's up next?
Taxes.
More specifically, potential changes to the way owner-occupied housing is taxed,
Visser talks about this idea of moving it from Box 1 to Box 3 in the Dutch tax system.
which is huge because so many people in the Netherlands own their homes.
Yeah, it would affect a big chunk of the population.
So what are these boxes exactly?
Box 1 is basically for income from work and home ownership with all the deductions and stuff.
Okay.
And Box 3 is for wealth and investments like savings and stocks.
So they're talking about taxing homes more like investments.
That's the idea. And Visser points out that second homes, those vakantiehuisjes, are already taxed in Box 3.
So there's a precedent.
Right. They're treated as assets.
But applying that to primary residences is a massive change.
It's sure to be controversial.
Visser says that one motivation for this shift might be to increase government revenue,
Okay, that makes sense.
and also to shift the tax burden away from income and towards wealth.
That's a whole debate about fairness. Totally. Who should pay more? Those who work or those who have assets?
But it's not like this policy is popular,
Visser mentions that it's not in any recent election programs,
nor in the current coalition agreement.
so politicians are hesitant to touch this.
Makes sense. It's a touchy subject. People are very attached to their homes.
Yeah. But Visser thinks that if it does happen, it'll likely come from left-leaning parties.
They're usually more in favor of taxing wealth.
And he says that even though it's politically sensitive, a lot of fiscal experts and economists see this as a common-sense move.
From a purely technical standpoint, it simplifies the tax system.
Makes it more logical.
But it's not just about logic, it's about the impact on people.
Visser emphasizes that. He says homeowners need to understand how this will affect them financially.
They need clarity. And it's not just about the overall impact, it's about fairness too.
How do you implement this fairly when homeowners have such diverse financial situations?
Especially older people on fixed incomes.
They could be hit hard.
And let's not forget the Dutch tax administration.
They're already struggling with backlogs.
Can they even handle a major change like this?
That's a good question. But beyond all the practical concerns, there's a fundamental issue here.
With that.
Homes are different from other assets in Box 3.
How so?
Well, a home doesn't generate direct income.
Like stocks do with dividends.
Exactly. You live in a home, it's not primarily an investment.
So taxing it like one is kind of strange.
And then there's this thing called the Eigenwoning forfait.
Eigenwoning for fate.
It's like an imputed rental value. They tax you as if you're renting your own home.
Okay.
And they're talking about replacing that with a Box 3 valuation.
Probably based on market value.
But Visser points out that even the current Box 3 system is really complicated.
They're still having legal issues figuring out how to tax actual returns.
So applying that same system to homes could just make things even more confusing.
And potentially lead to more legal challenges.
And then there's the risk of homeowners having to take on more debt.
To pay these wealth taxes,
They might have to increase their mortgages.
which could destabilize the housing market.
It's a big concern. And it all comes back to this core idea that Visser really pushes.
What's that?
A home is a place to live, first and foremost.
Not an investment.
And tax policy should reflect that.
Makes sense.
But it's easy to forget that when house prices are skyrocketing.
Especially when those increases are driven by things outside of the homeowner's control.
Like monetary policy, market forces.
Value of your home goes up, but you haven't actually done anything to make it happen.
It's this disconnect between market value and actual improvements to the property.
Which can make taxing those gains feel very unfair.
Especially when those gains haven't translated into more money in your pocket.
Okay, so lots of complexity with this housing tax idea.
Yeah, it's a mess. And Visser reminds us that the Dutch housing market is already pretty unique,
We have the mortgage interest deduction.
though it's not as impactful as it used to be.
And there's a real shortage of rental properties.
It all adds up to a very specific set of challenges.
So this whole box 1 to box 3 thing might not be the best solution.
Visser thinks it might be more likely that the government will just keep increasing taxes within the existing Box 3 framework,
Which means
raising taxes on savings and investments.
it's less controversial than going after primary residences.
Might be the path of least resistance.
But if they do raise taxes on wealth, Visser emphasizes a crucial point.
What's that?
They should lower taxes on labor at the same time.
It's about shifting the burden, not just increasing it overall.
Otherwise, everyone ends up paying more.
Well, finally, Visser asks this fundamental question.
What is it?
Is the government just trying to raise more revenue?
Because they want to spend more.
Or is it really about making the tax system fairer?
That's a key distinction. We need to understand the motivation behind these changes.
Totally. And Visser suggests that maybe we should look at cutting spending before we start adding new taxes.
Like maybe the healthcare budget.
It's huge. Maybe there are ways to be more efficient there.
It's always worth exploring those options.
So what's the takeaway from all this?
I'd say it's that the economic landscape is complex.
Very complex, and all these issues are connected.
Trade, corporations, inflation, taxes, they all influence each other.
We can't just look at them in isolation.
And we've really got to think about the bigger picture.
And the human impact of these economic forces.
Absolutely.
Especially when it comes to something as fundamental as housing.
Right. It's more than just an asset, it's people's homes.
So as you're thinking about this idea of taxing homes as wealth, consider this.
Okay.
If a home is primarily a place to live, a basic need, how should governments balance their need for money with ensuring everyone has access to affordable housing?
It's a tough question.
It is. And maybe we should be asking if our tax system should treat homes differently from pure investments.
Investments that are designed to make a profit.
This deep dive has given you a glimpse into the debates shaping our economic future.
Debates that will have a real impact on your lives.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep thinking critically about these issues.
Your perspective matters.